Hello, my name's John Fisher and I'd like to just talk to you for a few moments about a PCP inspired change curve that I came up with based on Kubler-Ross's bereavement curve, the process of transition, or as it appears to be more commonly known, the Fisher curve. This is quite simply a description of the journey that we go through as individuals emotionally when threatened with any change or when faced with any change. And it starts off with a little bit of anxiety about the change, and it's based on our perception of change, our perception of the impact of that change, whether we've been here before or not, and how we see that having an impact on our lives and our capabilities. So the anxiety, first of all, is just a very mild sort of, can I actually cope? What will happen? Will something happen or not? Which then really goes into a slight stage of happiness, euphoria around the great, something's changing, this is an opportunity, this is a chance. And then a little bit reality sets in. And we then start becoming slightly more fearful about what impact will it actually have, how will it affect me, and what will happen. And I came to think about this curve as a result of some counselling I was doing, where a lot of people were coming for the first session, having a really good session, making some big plans, making some important life-changing, in some cases, decisions, signing up for a following appointment and then never turning up. And I started referring to this as the second no-show. And I found that a lot of colleagues within the organisation I was counselling were having the same problems. And that's when this curve started to take shape for me, because I realised that it was about them suddenly realising that the impact and implications of their decisions were larger than they'd thought about. And while during the session they were caught up in the enthusiasm, the engagement and that desire to change, in the cold light of day things looked really different. So they started to become fearful because they had to change maybe their friends, they had to change their way of life, they had to change who they did what with. And this led into then a series of threat for themselves, in that their whole way of life were threatened, and potentially this had some major changes, major implications and a major impact. And as they go through this analysing, thinking about, then they start feeling guilty about the way they've behaved in the past, taking on board sort of all the mistakes that they've made and becoming, in Kellyan terms, a victim of their biography. And I did a year or two ago a little bit down this sort of downward slide that looks at anger. And I suggest that initially, in the early stages where they're still trying to work out the size, scape and scope of the impact on them, that they're angry at other people for putting them in this position. However, by the time they start feeling guilty about their behaviours, their choices that they've made, that anger turns inwards and they become quite angry at themselves, and that further perpetuates that anger, which, if they're not careful, leads into the sort of common definition of depression, where they're sad, they feel lost, they feel all at sea and not quite sure where to go or what to do. And then they, if we assume the positive, they start getting a handle on the change, they start taking control, ownership of that change, and they start moving forwards in a eating the elephant one bite at a time way, by making gradual changes, by seeing themselves in the future working well, by envisaging the new world. So Covey's begin with the end in mind, his habit of actually understanding what success looks like and what the change looks like, to them actually moving forwards and making it work, making it happen, and making the most of their new environment. Now, what I've also done is I realise there are some roads that people can take off this curve as they go through it, so they don't have to go through the curve in a straight line, as it were. One of the first, of course, is denial. They can just refuse to accept that there's any change happening and just sit there and pretend nothing's happened. At the other extreme and off the bottom end of the curve, people can decide not to feel guilt and depression, but to actively make other people realise that we're stupid for changing. And this, in Kellyan terms, is called hostility. And hostilities isn't about being angry, it's just about a lot of energy is being used to prove there is no need to change. So denial and hostility for me are two sides of the same coin, with just the amount of energy expanded. That's the only difference. The third and possibly most intriguing route off the curve is one I've called disillusionment. And by that I mean a recognition that it's not me that's at fault, it's the system, the organisation, the change that is compromising my core beliefs and values, my core constructs. And this is where, rather than to fall into the trap of self-blame, self-anger and self-pity, I choose to put myself in a different place, and I choose to go and leave this change behind and change my environment. So the old saying, if the person doesn't change, the person will change. This is where I make the choice to change and change the environment, not me. Finally, somebody wrote to me a few years ago now and suggested that there's a sort of half stage at the beginning and end, which they call complacency. And they defined that as when you've been through change and when you look back, you think, what was I worried about? What was all the fuss about? And you are just happy, relieved, and almost paint over the pain that you went through as you went through the change process. Now, the complacency one is an interesting one for me, from a practical reason, because it's the only one that isn't really based on Kelly's personal construct theory. So that one is more about maybe other people observing the individual. It's about whether they are relaxed, happy that they've gone through it, so the complacent mindset of I've got through that change and survived it, or it may be that I'm still a little bit stuck type of stage, where they haven't quite worked out or are in that almost grey area, phony area of getting ready for the next phase of the change to come along. So the complacency one is, as I say, quite interesting, and one I'm still working through and looking for more support to justify it. However, you may see people who go into this sort of, they've got through it okay, but might just not quite be present in the true sense of the word. So it's just be aware that this is under investigation, as it were, and is one way of looking at what happens after I've gone through the change and come out of the other side. One way that I've used this curve, and it's fair to say that there's really two things that are important. One is that this cycle is never ending, and that we're always working through it, we're always somewhere on it. And I suppose the other one is that there are multiple curves, so we can be on lots of different curves at different times during the same day, just because of how we're reacting to our environment. So we could be on one because we're changing jobs, but we're also moving house. We're also experiencing something that's happening, anticipating a new film or book coming out. It can be in any of those instances. I tend to use it with people and with groups as well to help them explore where they are on the curve, because sometimes it's not obvious where you are and you may not even recognise where you are on it. Some people can and do because the situation is there. So I get people exploring where they can be on that curve, where they where they want to go to, how they want to get there, and it's helping people understand. And there are a series of questions that Nathalie Nagayan has written that help expand on all of those areas and all of those phases that just get people looking at what their position is really. And I've used those as discussion points so people help each other and almost co-counsel. I use it as an explanation in one-on-one, or we get groups of people to explore their environment and to map where their team are on the change curve so that they can then start making effective plans in how to hold conversations with people. Because as a manager or leader or as a change agent, anybody who's on the downward slope, you need to be supporting, communicating, helping them understand what the end is, what the advantages they'll get from there, how they can move there. And I sometimes incorporate Finn Schude's ABC technique with the work I'm doing on this with people who are really stuck in their change, as well as future planning work and again, COVID's begin with the end in mind. So help them understand. I've also used Tad James's timelining with this and get people to walk the curve or walk across the valley and then look back and look at that journey that they've taken to get from one side to the other in a safer, more effective, less emotionally intense way. So there are quite a few ways that I've used it and that other people have used it. Physically walking it is a really good way because people then get engaged into the emotion, can feel those emotions, and if it's facilitated, then they can get through them and start making real choices about their future.